Historical Society for having me here tonight. So, thank you all for coming out. I appreciate it. And just to give you a little background on the format for the talk, I'll be talking for about 35, 40 minutes, and then I'm happy to take questions. So, I study early American women because I really feel they've been underrepresented in the telling of America's story. And if we're not hearing about how half the population helped build this country, we're really not getting a full or an accurate picture of the American past. And a few years ago, when I first heard of Penelope Winslow, I was initially surprised she wasn't better known. As a member of the English gentry and wife to Plymouth Colony Governor Josiah Winslow, she was arguably one of the most powerful women in Plymouth's history. And the reason she isn't better known is that it's really only been within the past few decades that women's history has been studied, really with the development of the women's movement in the 1960s and 70s, and also with the development of the field of social history, which stresses the importance of studying the experiences of all groups of people, not just male leaders. So I will start by giving you a little biography of Penelope. And one other obstacle to getting to know her story was the fact that she left little behind in the way of writings. So unlike the subject of my first book, The Hannibal Chandler Coy, there's no diary to mine the details of her life. But she is mentioned in some records, and there's also a wealth of what's called material culture. And that's basically anything made or used by people that really help give an idea of not only her life, but of the lives of other women of the time and the development of women as a whole. And in Penelope's case, these items range from her portrait to surviving homes, to surviving personal possessions, and even archaeological artifacts. So to give a little biography of Penelope, she was born in 1633 in a village about 70 miles outside of London called Ewers. And as I mentioned, she was a member of the English gentry. So her father, Herbert Pelham, was descended from various monarchs. And in fact, Penelope's third great-grandmother on her father's side was Mary Boleyn, whom you may have heard referred to as the other Boleyn girl. He's having to go with Henry VIII before Anne came into the picture. And on Penelope's mother's side, her mother was Jemima Waldegrave. And the Waldegraves have been active in British politics for centuries. So then when Penelope came over to the colony, she's related to a host of very prominent people here. Her relative is the Baron de la Warr, after whom the colony of Delaware is named. She's related to governors of Virginia and leading settlers of Massachusetts Bay. And all of these connections were very important to her and really helped to give her a sense of identity and her place in the world. So Penelope, I'll show you some of the family homes that survive that are related to Penelope. So the first is Smallbridge Hall. Now, my husband and I were fortunate enough to be able to visit these homes a few years ago. This home, Smallbridge Hall, belonged to her mother's parents. It was actually much larger in Penelope's day. So you can see it's a very grand residence with a moat and a deer park. Queen Elizabeth I is supposed to have stayed there, which she did stay there. And this is the room that she's supposed to have stayed in. And what was great when we visited was that this house and also Penelope's birthplace, which I'll show you next, they were undergoing restoration. So the rooms were really stripped of furnishings, and you could really get an idea of what they may have looked like during Penelope's time. And this is Farrier, so this is Penelope's birthplace. Obviously not as grand as Smallbridge Hall, but it was absolutely an impressive dwelling for the time period. You can't see, but it really extends far along the back. And so again, she is growing up in a very, very comfortable environment for the time period. This is a painting of Farrier's done in 1962 by a well-known artist named John Nash. You can see Farrier's there, and I'm showing this because it shows the spreading landscape. So really, as far as the eye could see, it was property owned by Penelope's family. And then these are just some architectural features of Farrier's. And this is a courthouse. So this is a rare memorial courthouse dating from the 1500s. Now, Ferriers was brought to the marriage by Penelope's mother, and Penelope's mother's family had used this courthouse. And the picture here, it's under this building was undergoing restoration, which explains why it looks that way. But Penelope's father was a justice of the peace, and so he too likely used this to hear, to deal with local grievances. But the whole point is that the whole Ferriers complex was a real site of economic, social, and political power. And again, this really informs Penelope's background. So when she's about 5 years old, in about 1638, her father, who is a merchant, adventurer, investor in Massachusetts Bay, decides he wants to move the family over to Massachusetts to settle in Cambridge. And he takes Penelope and her 4 siblings. Her mother died on the voyage, but the family settled in Cambridge. The father remarries within a year, and he acquires lots of land, positions of civic responsibility, and he becomes Harvard's first treasurer. So he's doing very well for himself. But then within 8 years, he decides he needs to return to England to settle some property disputes arising from inheritance issues. And so he takes Penelope's siblings, with the exception of her brother Nathaniel, who's going to stay behind to attend Harvard, and Penelope herself. And it's unclear why Penelope, at 13 years of age, would not join the rest of her family. Later indications are that she may not have had the best relationship with her stepmother. But in any case, at this point, she probably goes to live with her father's sister, another Penelope, who, with her husband, a very prominent individual named Richard Bellingham, he serves as governor of Massachusetts for several terms. They live in downtown Boston. And at their house in downtown Boston, Penelope is really exposed to a wealth of ideas and people that really broaden her world. We don't know exactly what type of education she had, but it was evidently a very good one as later documents attest. But in any case, we do know that Penelope eventually meets Josiah Winslow here on the left, whom she will go on to marry. Not clear how exactly she meets Josiah. Josiah was at Harvard, he was older than her brother, but also her father and Edward Winslow here on the right were well known to each other. Now, Edward Winslow, you may remember, was a Mayflower passenger, and he was married to Josiah's mother, who was Susanna Wright Winslow. She was a Mayflower passenger too, but both Edward and Susanna were married to different people on the voyage who died in the first winter. So their marriage was actually the first one that took place in Plymouth. And they had 2 surviving children. One was Josiah, and one was a daughter, Elizabeth. Now, the portrait of Penelope, Josiah, and Edward are painted in 1651 in London. We don't know by whom, because they're not signed, but the reason we know they're painted in 1651 is because the letter that Edward is holding, the only thing that is legible is 1651, and the signature of the letter, which is from your loving wife, Susanna. So, great story, right? So they have their portraits painted in London. We're not sure if Penelope and Josiah are married in London or back in the colonies, but in any case, they are there in London to have their portraits painted. So I wanted to back up for a minute and talk to you about religion. So really oversimplified, we know that the people who settled Massachusetts were Puritans, and the people who settled Plymouth Colony, we call them Pilgrims. So the Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England. They thought it hadn't gone far enough in stripping away ritual when the Church of England separated from the Catholic Church. So the Puritans wanted to purify the Church. The separatists thought it was, they would just go for the Church of England. They wanted to form a different religion, but in any case, they had very similar viewpoints. And I'm talking about this now because when we look at these portraits, we see these 2 men dressed in black, and we think, oh, they're drab clothing, typical Puritans. But actually, the reason they're dressed in black is because it's the most expensive dye to make. It's also a very fashionable color at the time. They're dressed this way to display their wealth. So at this time, social status was extremely important. And in fact, there were sumptuary laws laws on the books in England and New England that prevented people from dressing above their social class. But the Winslows didn't have to worry about this because they're a very high social class, so they not only have the expensive black fabric, but they have the gold tassels around the neck. Edward has the gold buttons, and they have the starched white collars, and Edward has the starched white cuffs. And now we want to take a closer look at Penelope's portrait. So they were painted in 1651. So the English Civil Wars had just come to an end. And 2 years previously, King Charles I had been executed by followers of Oliver Cromwell and his parliamentarian forces, who were very many of them were Puritans. Now, the Pelhams and the Winslows were absolutely supporters of Cromwell. And yet, we look at Penelope, and she's dressed very similarly to Queen Henrietta Maria, Charles I's wife, on the left, and to his daughter, Princess Mary Stuart, on the right. She has the fabrics that she's wearing, the colors and the style of fabric is very similar to Queen Henrietta Maria's, and the choker necklace, the hairstyle, she has a little hood, very similar to Princess Mary Stuart. So she's choosing to align herself with the uppermost echelons of society. So the Winslow portraits are shipped back to the colonies to Marshfield, where Penelope and Josiah lived. They descend through the family, through generations, and in the 1800s they are donated to Pelham Hall Museum, which you may be familiar with. In Plymouth, it's the oldest continuously operating public museum in the country, and it also has the pre-eminent collection of Pilgrim possessions. So what's interesting is that Pilgrim Hall has a number of possessions that belonged to Penelope. So the most iconic of these is the shoe. So this was formerly salmon pink color, has this very ornate silver lace, has this weird, forked toe, right? And the story is that Penelope wore it after the wedding, and it was worn by subsequent family brides until in the 1800s, the mate of that shoe descended through another brother, and it remains in the family. This one was donated to Pelham Hall. Now, a stir was caused as recently as the 1990s when the descendant owner of the other shoe found out about this shoe at Pelham Hall Museum, and there's loads of excitement when both shoes were displayed together at Pelham Hall for the first time. It's a really powerful legend of Penelope wearing these shoes at her wedding. Unfortunately, the interpretation of the shoes has changed dramatically with the revelation that they were actually a man's shoes. They were actually a fancy indoor slipper, probably worn by Josiah. So when I first started researching Penelope, I was talking to the then curator at Pelham Hall, Stephen O'Neill. He happened to mention that a British footwear expert footwear historian had been at Pelham Hall and happened to mention that she thought the shoe was a man's. So I thought, well, I need to follow up on that. So I consulted with 3 fashion historians. They all concurred, yes, that this was a shoe made for a man. Men wore these, fancy slippers back in the mid-1600s, and it just, I think, there's a lesson there, a couple of lessons. One, you can't trust all of these stories that come down with heirlooms. One, we have to be very careful about our contemporary ideas that we project onto things of the past. But then the fun thing about it, too, is that it's emblematic of the fact that the story of Penelope, the story of early American women, is always evolving because new information is always coming to light, and we're interpreting new sources in new ways as we find out more information. So this is just showing you another pair of high heel shoes. These are the Victorian and Albert Museum. They're obviously not as ornate as Josiah's slipper, but they were a formerly salmon pink color, because that was very popular for men and women to wear in the middle of the 1600s. And then, just for effect, this is Josiah's baby shoes here on the right, and they're displayed close to the Winslow shoe in the museum. So I just like that. Now, this is a bag that Penelope is supposed to have made. It's at Pilgrim Hall Museum on a sea very romantic, idea, and perhaps it's true. I do know that the date coincides with Penelope's lifetime, the first half of the 1600s, so it could be true. It did descend through the family, but we're just not entirely sure. However, the item to the right, it's called a bodkin. It's a silver blunt-edged needle with holes at either end. It has the initials PW. It did descend through the family, and the date is good. Now, this made me think, it's a pretty intimate item because it would have been used by Penelope in dressing. There's lots of laces involved in clothing at that time. And then it also made me think about Penelope as a mother, because at that time, of course, there weren't maternity clothes. Women would just let out their clothes when they were pregnant and then take them back in. Thinking about Penelope as a mother, she had a very difficult time having children. Her first surviving child, a daughter named Elizabeth, was born in 1664, so about 13 years after her marriage. And her next surviving child was a son named Isaac, born in 1621, so about 20 years after her marriage. Now, we're so fortunate in that archaeological excavations have been done at Penelope and Josiah's house. In fact, there's so many excavations that have been done in this area, and they're ongoing, and so they're always revealing new information. Now, the home site was first excavated in 1940 by an archaeologist named Henry Hornblower, who went on to found the site. It was Plymouth, originally Plymouth Plantation, now it's Plymouth Patuxent. And then since there have been other digs and it's been reinterpreted. So, but we do know we have this floor plan, which is great. And the hall on the right-hand side is typical of a home layout at that time. Most of the day-to-day living took place in the hall. But then to the left is a parlor, and that's a more formal room for entertaining, but also for a space for a man to conduct his business. Now, at this time, this is well before the Industrial Revolution, so most men are conducting their jobs from home. And there is a role that a wife is supposed to take on when she marries. It's called that of deputy husband. And that means that if her husband is not around, she's expected to be able to stand in and deal with creditors or customers. And it is recognized by the husbands and by other men that a wife will have this knowledge. And so we have to think about Penelope in this role, because Josiah not only has extensive commercial interests, but also he is very prominent in Plymouth government from the beginning. So from the 1650s, he has different roles. He becomes he succeeds Miles Standish as the military leader, and then he ultimately becomes governor in 1673. And so at this time, there are these elaborate rituals of hospitality among the lower classes. And men coming to the home know that they have to have a good relationship with Penelope because she's like a gatekeeper. She can mediate access to Josiah, mediate messages that are given to him. So there's that aspect. But then we also have to think of women coming to the house to seek Penelope, to seek favors on their husband's behalf. And so there's this whole group of women behind the scenes that are really having an impact on the workings of the community and on the colony. Just to show you a couple of possessions that kind of household furnishings that just kind of round out a picture of life at home. This is a very ornate, expensive chair. It used to have a seat cushion, and we could just kind of imagine Josiah perched on it, being all authoritarian and conducting his government business. And on the left here is this Delft plate, and I'm showing that because there's an enduring stereotype that Plymouth Colony was about very insular. It's not the case. It was intercoastal trade, there's transatlantic trade. It's a much more cosmopolitan place than is often been described. And so not only are there high-style European ceramics and items in well-to-do homes, but then in the archaeological artifacts they find remnants of lesser quality European goods, that people had. So all kinds of people had access to these things. And I'm just showing this cradle on the right. It's another iconic element, another iconic item at Pilgrim Hall. It's called the Peregrine White Cradle. And the story is that Susanna White. At that time, she was married to William White. She's pregnant on the voyage, and she's supposed to have brought this cradle over on the Mayflower for her child, Peregrine, who's the first English child born in New England. And the cradle descended to the family, so it may have been used by Penelope. Now, and here are some of the archaeological artifacts that help round out the insights that we get from the surviving possessions. So we think of Penelope as a needlewoman, if she made that bag. There are scissors, fragments of scissors all over the place at that site. There are so many pieces of, so many pins and hooks and eyes, all kinds of sewing implements, because all women would have done some sewing. Not all the pieces were necessarily hers, but some of them probably were. That up top is a fine bone needle case that when the archaeologists found it still contained the pins, which is pretty amazing. In the middle is this may be a Godfrey, and it speaks to Penelope and Josiah's penchant for high style, because it's specifically used for ironing ruffles. And then the knife. There were lots of knives, lots of spoons found at the site. No forks, because no one was using forks in this area at that time. But even archaeologists have looked at the types of animal bones that are found there to see what they ate. And like good English people, they ate a lot of beef. Then we get a lot of some items that speak to child life. So this is a silver whistle with the initials EW. May have belonged to Penelope and Josiah's daughter, Elizabeth. And then a marble. Now, there were lots of native artifacts found at the site too. Some of them thousands of years old, of course speaking to the fact that native peoples had lived in the area for thousands of years before the settlers came. But what's also interesting, and archaeologists are finding this at sites all across the region, is that there's so much evidence of not only the native peoples and the colonists living very close together, but also that they are transferring goods and technology. So there are remnants of native pots found in Penelope and Josiah's home site, indicating that they, like their neighbors, sometimes cooked on native pots. And then these items here are just pieces of metal taken from kettles that were used in trade with the native peoples, and the native peoples used to sometimes just take them apart and use the metal for different purposes, to suit their own purposes. So they would use them for jewelry or contribute to pieces for tools and things. So when we talk about the native peoples, we have to talk about the defining moment of Josiah's governorship, which is King Philip's War, which broke out in 1675 and lasted through 1676. Now, the Winslows in New England had a very complicated relationship with native peoples. Edward Winslow, when he came over, he was very curious about native culture and tried to learn indigenous language and had relationships with different native peoples. And we know of his fabled friendship with the person we know as Massasoit, leader of the Wampanoag. Massasoit just means basically great leader. He took the name Usamiquin, so we should call him Massasoit Usamiquin. Josiah did not share that curiosity about native culture. And also at this time, the time he's governor, it's the second generation, so more and more people have come to New England. They're encroaching on native lands, and there's more pressure on native peoples to convert to Christianity. So all these tensions erupt in King Philip's War. And fascinatingly, Penelope was a participant in two instances that are, two events that are often pointed to as being pivotal in the outbreak of the war. So the first one takes place in 1662, before Josiah is governor, and he is a military leader, and he is sent to bring Wamsutta, who is then the sachem of the Wampanoag, to answer some charges. So by this time, Massasoit Usamiquin has passed away, and he has left two sons, Wamsutta, who takes the English name Alexander, and Metacom, who takes the English name Philip. So Wamsutta is the sachem, and he is accused of selling land contrary to the terms of the treaty and also of conspiring with the Narragansetts against the conquest. So Josiah goes to Armstead's home, and he finds him there with his wife, Weedamo, who is also a sachem. She's a sachem of the Castle. And they're also with some family members. And it's decided that rather than bring Wamsutter directly to Plymouth to answer these charges, they are going, the whole group is going to go to Penelope in Josiah's home and spend the night. So this is so fascinating to consider this large, obviously Penelope had many interactions with Native peoples, but to have a large group at her home like that, and also thinking about Weedamo and Penelope in any interactions. So even though Penelope was a very high-ranking person, she had lots of informal influence and power, Weedamo was a sachem. She was an acknowledged leader of her people. And so she, in the grand scheme of things, would have outranked Penelope, but of course Penelope wouldn't have seen it like that. But in any case, the visit unfortunately does not go well, because Wamsutter becomes ill, and Josiah calls for the doctor, who may have inadvertently made Wamsutter worse. It's decided he needs to return home and recover before he can go to Plymouth and answer these charges. He goes home and shortly thereafter dies. And it's believed by his wife Weedamo and his brother Metatons, aka Philip, that Wamsutter has been poisoned, perhaps by the doctor or perhaps by Josiah. So then fast forwarding 14 years, late 1774, Josiah is governor, and there is a native, Harvard-educated Christian minister named John Sassaman who comes to Penelope and Josiah's home to warn Josiah of Metapon's plans to attack. And again, just thinking, he's at their home. Penelope may very well have interacted with him, but she certainly discussed the nature of his visit after he left, given what happens. So he comes, John Sassaman tries to warn Josiah. Josiah does not believe him because he's received different warnings in the past and they haven't come to anything. John Sassaman leaves saying, "I fear for my life," and he disappears. And then a few weeks later, his body is found. And it's believed that he's been murdered by agents of Metacom. And so 3 men with ties to Metacom are shortly thereafter arrested, imprisoned, tried, and executed. And shortly after that, King Philip's War breaks out. So it's a terrible, devastating conflict. To date, per capita, it still is the bloodiest conflict that the countries ever engaged in. That's because the population was so low. There were more casualties per capita from this war. It's, as I said, it's just terrible, terrible moment. Josiah, knowing that Metacom bears this personal animosity toward him, thinking that Josiah had murdered his brother, poisoned his brother, decides that he needs to send Penelope and their children away. At this point, Elizabeth, their daughter, is 11, the son Isaac is 4. So he makes arrangements for the family to go stay with his sister Elizabeth and her husband George Crone in Salem. And so Penelope and her children, like many people on both sides, become war refugees. And Josiah writes this very dramatic letter to the Massachusetts governor, John Leverett, saying, "I have fortified my house, I have sent my family away, and I will maintain my position as long as man will stand by me." And what's really chilling is that evidence of this is witnessed in the landscape. So there are post holes that survive, indicating that the home had been fortified. There are multiple pipe stems showing evidence of these soldiers on guard. There are bullets, gun fragments, pieces of armor. Then we have, of course, Josiah with his high-style items. We have high-style horse furniture, bridles, bits, these buckles, for gun straps. So again, it's chilling, and it just gives that much more of an impact to the narrative provided in the written record to see these items. So the war concludes in August of 1676 when Metacom is killed. And afterwards, Penelope returns home and she tries to help Josiah repair his relationship with King Charles II. So at this point, the monarchy has been restored in England in 1660. King Charles II had taken the throne, and he's still on the throne in 1676. And he's wondering what happened in the colonies for native colonial relations to deteriorate to the point where there was this terrible war. And so Penelope helps Josiah, reaching out to her family connections by engaging with her brother Waldegrave, who has inherited Ferriers. Her father's passed away, and he's inherited Ferriers back in yours, to bring a report that Josiah writes, as well as Metacom's war cries. So this is Metacom's military regalia, including, this is not an accurate representation of Metacom. This was done 100 years later by Paul Revere, this engraving, but it does show this wampum belt. And there were these two fabulous wampum belts that were sent with this report to King Charles II. And Waldegrave, Penelope's brother, evidently was not worthy of the trust, or was not up to the job, because they never reached him. They never made it to court. And it's been this enduring mystery, what happened to King Philip's wampum belts. And they have a lot of significance to the Wampanoag people. And when my husband and I were at Ferriers, as I said, it was under restoration. The owners are aware of the story of the wampum belts, and there's have been rumors that Waldegrave hid them on the property. The owners are pretty confident that he did not. But the Wampanoag people are still looking for these wampum belts, so it's so interesting. Now, the war has taken a great toll on Josiah's health, and he dies 4 years later in 1680. And Penelope is supposed to have commissioned this mourning ring to commemorate his passing. It was made as the mark of John Coney, a Boston gold and silversmith. And it presumably contains a lock of Josiah's hair, as you see that. The date is good, it did descend through the family, but there's no inscription, so we can't be 100% sure that the story is accurate. But in any case, we do know Penelope had a very difficult time with Josiah's passing. A letter that Plymouth Colony Secretary Nathaniel Morton wrote to her is trying to console her and references her grief. We don't have any letters that have survived between Penelope and Josiah. However, when he made his will, he left her broad powers over the estate. So at the time, it was customary for men to leave their wife a third of the personal property and a third life interest only in any real estate. And Josiah left Penelope control of the entire estate. Obviously with the understanding that it would pass to their son when he came of age, but she was given power to sell, do whatever she needed to do. So obviously he had complete faith in her financial management abilities, which he would have demonstrated, in the years when he was traveling on military business or government business, and she had to oversee things herself. Now, we're not sure what happened to Penelope in Josiah's house. It clearly fell down. Not in probably very late 1600s or early 1700s. She may have lived her final couple of years at this house that you may recognize as the circa 1699 Winslow house in Marshfield that was built by Penelope's son Isaac and his wife Sarah Wensley. And so, as I said, she may have lived there for the final 3 years of her life. She remained active. She remained a widow for the final 23 years of her life. And she remained very active, too. She also, later in life, was involved in 2 legal suits to retain family inheritances. And one of these legal suits, occurred in 1703, the year she died. And there's this amazing petition she wrote to the governor of Massachusetts arguing her case, which was ultimately decided in her favor, but not until after her death. So I'm just going to show you one final material item related to Penelope, and that is this commemorative stone that marks the site of her in Josiah's house in Marshfield. It was erected in the 1900s, and it's basically paying homage to Governors Edward and Josiah Winslow. It doesn't say anything about Susanna White Winslow, no mention of Penelope. And it's just such a heavily symbolic, it's so heavily symbolic of the covering up and erasure of women's history that has taken place over the years. And in conclusion, I would just say that there are so many interesting but unknown stories that need to be recovered, and looking at sources, non-written sources, to get at the stories of ordinary people who made an impact on their time is so important, and it's up for us to find a way to tell these stories. So, thank you very much.